The journey to the great claiming hall began before dawn, the carriage wheels grinding against wet cobblestones. Seraphina sat rigidly on the leather bench, her fingers gripping her faded gray wool dress. Elena sat across from her, the loyal maid since childhood, her face creased with concern. Outside the window, the Eastern Territories scrolled past. Fields of dormant grain, forests with bare branches clawing at gray sky, villages where people watched them pass with knowing eyes. They all knew where she was going. 9 years. The number haunted her. 9 years since her father had signed the betrothal contract with trembling hands when she was barely 15. An alliance with House Varen, he had said, his voice hollow. What he hadn't said was that the Voss holdings were already failing, yet that this betrothal was a desperate survival move disguised as strategy. She had never met Lord Aldric Varen. There were only whispers, servant gossip, fragments of overheard conversations, the way courtiers scattered when he entered a room. They said he was ambitious. They said he was cruel. The stories had built a monster in her mind, but monsters were easier to fear than men. As the sun climbed higher, Seraphina felt her heartbeat accelerate with each passing hour. She pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching her breath fog and fade. She had prepared for this every day of her adult life, schooling her expressions, practicing the arts of managing a household. But no amount of preparation could make this feel real. They reached the claiming territories at midday, passing beneath an ancient stone archway. Even as they crested a hill, the claiming hall appeared, and Seraphina's breath caught. The great claiming hall stretched before her, like the mouth of some ancient beast, carved stone pillars rising toward a ceiling lost in shadow. It was massive in a way that photographs and dusty books had failed to convey. Truly vast, a monument to centuries of power and tradition. The building seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, the gray stone so dark it was nearly black. As their carriage pulled to a stop before the wide entrance, Seraphina could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. This hall had hosted thousands of claims, thousands of ceremonies, thousands of moments like this, where people's lives were irrevocably altered by words spoken before witnesses. Elena helped her from the carriage. Yarn Seraphina's feet touched stone that had been worn smooth by centuries of walking. Her hands trembled as she stood, trying to compose herself. The dress she wore, gray wool, faded from years of wear, suddenly felt thinner than paper, insufficient against the weight of 1,000 eyes waiting somewhere within those massive doors. 9 years of dread had led to this moment, this threshold she now had to cross. There could be no turning back. The contract had been signed. The ceremony was only a formality, a legal confirmation of what had already been decided. The hall itself was a monument to power. Wolf-head banners hung from the vaulted walls, their embroidered eyes seeming to follow her progress toward the raised dais where the betrothal scroll lay unrolled on a polished obsidian table. Candles flickered in iron sconces, while casting dancing shadows that made the hall feel alive, breathing. The nobility of the Eastern Territories filled the space. Merchants and minor lords, warriors with scarred faces, women draped in silks and jewels. At the back stood the common folk, crammed into the gallery, here to witness the binding that would secure peace between the House of Varen and the remnants of her father's legacy. What was left of it, anyway? After his death 2 years ago, the estate had withered. Only this betrothal remained valuable, this empty promise of alliance. Every step toward the dais felt like walking through water. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out the whispered conversations of the assembled nobility. She could feel them assessing her, unmarked skin, untested bloodline, diminished estates. What the whispers followed her like smoke. The Voss inheritance, barely solvent, fortunate to have any match at all. Her throat felt tight, her breathing shallow. 9 years of knowing this day was coming hadn't prepared her for the reality of it. The finality. The door closing on any other life she might have imagined for herself. Lord Aldric descended the dais steps with the measured pace of a predator. He was taller than expected, angular like a sickle blade. His pale blue eyes swept over her with an appraiser's coldness, and Seraphina felt her skin crawl. He wore burgundy wool trimmed in gold, the scent of his cologne sharp and chemical, suffocating. "So this is the Voss legacy," he said, his voice smooth as oiled silk. He cupped her chin, tilting her face upward with reptilian fingers. "Rather plain, honestly. The bloodline is acceptable. Open your mouth. I need to assess your teeth. A bride's value depends significantly on her capacity to bear children." The entire hall had gone silent. A a silence so complete it felt like drowning. She could feel hundreds of eyes upon her, a weight pressing down like physical force. Some noble ladies looked away in embarrassment. Others watched with cold interest, as though she were livestock being assessed. She parted her lips hesitantly, trembling, and Aldric examined her teeth as though she were a horse, his eyes clinical and detached. Heat flooded her face with burning humiliation. Shame twisted in her belly, dark and vicious, rooting itself into her bones. Hips need improvement for bearing, he continued, releasing her chin and letting his fingers trail down her side, moving deliberately across the curve of her waist, over her hip bones, with a touch that felt like desecration. His hand lingered on her body, possessive, claiming, assessing her like a farmer examining livestock at market. The structure is acceptable, though barely. Has she been used, or is she untouched? A bride's worth depends entirely on her condition, and I will not be deceived about the quality of my acquisition. Have you been with a man? Speak truly, or I will know you're lying. The question hung in the air like a blade, sharp and deadly. Seraphina wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee this hall, abandon the contract, disappear into the forests beyond the castle walls. But her father's legacy depended on this arrangement. Now, the few servants still employed at her estate, people who had been loyal to her family for generations, the small holdings that kept them fed through winter, the modest house that was all that remained of the Voss fortune, all of it balanced on this betrothal. She had known this would be her life since she was old enough to understand what a contract meant. Duty, sacrifice, the erasure of self for the sake of survival. Her body wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the contract, to the alliance, to the whim of a man who viewed her as chattel, a thing to be owned and used and discarded when he tired of it. "The lady is untouched," came a voice from the crowd. Seraphina's lady's maid, Elena, had spoken without being addressed, a breach of protocol that made several nobles shift uncomfortably. But Elena's voice was steady, protective, and cutting through the degradation like a lifeline. "She was raised in seclusion, my lord, pure as winter snow." Aldric's thin smile widened, revealing teeth that reminded Seraphina of something predatory. "Perfect. Then our arrangement is sealed." He gestured toward the betrothal scroll with the casual dismissal of a man who had already moved on to the next acquisition. "Bring her to sign." This was the moment when her fate would be bound to parchment and ink, witnessed by hundreds, blessed by the old laws that had governed their people for centuries. Seraphina walked to the obsidian table on legs that felt distant from her body, as though she were watching herself move from somewhere outside her skin. The black stone of the table felt cold beneath her fingertips, so as her hand shook as she reached for the quill that lay beside the scroll. The ink was red, blood red, as custom demanded. It looked like actual blood, and something in that symbolism made her stomach turn. She was signing away her autonomy in blood. The quill was heavy in her trembling hand. She dipped it in the inkwell and brought it toward the parchment. This was it. This was the moment where her childhood dreams would officially die, where the woman she might have been would be buried forever beneath the weight of duty and obedience and a stranger's control. She could feel Aldric watching her from across the table, a thin smile playing at his lips, already imagining his ownership of her body, her labor, her children. And then the doors at the far end of the hall exploded inward. Not burst, exploded. They shattered like rotten wood. There's the massive oak doors that had stood for centuries, fracturing into splinters that flew through the air as though a storm had made them its target. The sound was apocalyptic. The shriek of metal and wood tearing, the crash of massive doors collapsing inward with a force that seemed to shake the foundation of the hall itself. Seraphina's quill froze above the parchment mid-stroke. The ink dripped from the nib onto the scroll, red upon red, staining the words with crimson tears. A hush fell over the crowd, but not the hush of silence, the hush of held breath, of fear, of something vast and dangerous entering a space too small to contain it. The very air seemed to tremble. And then he walked through the ruined doorway. He emerged into shadow, his silhouette framed by the shattered threshold. The coat he wore was black leather, worn from use. It was cut to accommodate his broad shoulders. As he moved forward, the shadows fell away, and Seraphina could see him truly. He was impossibly tall, his head clearing the courtiers by a handspan. His hair was true black, like midnight water, falling past his shoulders in untamed waves. His face was sharp but not cruel. The sharp jaw of a warrior, the sharp nose of a scholar, the sharp gaze of someone who missed nothing. And his eyes, His eyes were steel gray with rings of amber around the pupils. The color of storm clouds shot through with lightning, looking directly at her. The moment their eyes met, something shifted in the universe. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't subtle. It was a collision, a recognition so profound that her entire body seized with the force of it. Her heartbeat, which had been thundering in her ears like a panicked animal, suddenly synchronized with something else. A second heartbeat that resonated through the mate bond, matching her rhythm perfectly. The sensation was electric, impossible, overwhelming. Every nerve in her body suddenly became aware of his presence in a way that transcended physical sight. She could smell him, leather and pine and something wild and ancient, a scent that made something primal in her respond with immediate recognition. The gold flecks in her eyes, which had always been subtle, suddenly brightened to a vivid shade, responding to the amber in his gaze like flowers turning toward sunlight. The mate bond ignited, not like a candle flame, but like an inferno, like lightning striking, like her entire body had suddenly caught fire from the inside out. There was no other way to describe it. Yet the connection came alive in her blood like a second heartbeat, humming through her bones with the force of lightning, flooding her senses with an awareness so complete it was almost violent. His scent hit her like a physical wave, leather and pine and something wild and ancient, something feral and utterly intoxicating, a scent her body recognized before her mind could process it. Warmth flooded through her, spreading from her chest outward in waves that made her skin prickle with sensitivity. Heat concentrated in her belly, her chest, her very core, a burning that was part pleasure and part pure animal need. Her heartbeat accelerated from synchronized rhythm into something faster, more frantic, responding to every fiber of his being. The mate bond sang between them, not yet the deep, satisfied hum of claimed partnership, but the frantic, hungry passion of two halves recognizing each other across impossible distance. The physical manifestation was unmistakable. A golden light began to glow around them both, faint at first, then brighter, becoming visible to every creature in the hall. It wasn't reflected light. It was something that emanated from within them, from the bond itself, from the goddess's declaration written in pure spiritual fire. Her entire body felt suffused with it, every cell vibrating with the truth of it. The green flecks in her eyes brightened to vivid gold, responding to the amber in his gaze with a fire of their own. Her skin flushed with heat and awareness. The dress she wore suddenly felt unbearably restrictive, too heavy, too much fabric between her body and the open air. She wanted to tear it away. She wanted to move toward him. Every instinct in her screamed at her to cross the distance between them, to touch him, to claim him as thoroughly as she was being claimed. She heard Aldric's breath catch beside her, a sharp, inward gasp. His hand, which had been resting possessively on her waist, fell away as though he'd been burned. "That's impossible," he hissed, his voice cracking with disbelief and fury. "The bond is false. This is a trick, witchcraft, sorcery to deny my rightful claim. The bond cannot be real." "The Alpha King," someone whispered in the crowd, and the name rippled through the hall like a stone tossed into still water. Kael Thornvane, the man who had inherited the throne after his father's death, who ruled the northern territories with an iron hand and a reputation for merciless justice. The man who was supposedly uninterested in alliances. Who had dismissed a dozen suitors from the great houses because none of them interested him. Seraphina had heard tavern songs about him, stories of his brutality in war, the way his enemies fell before his war sword, the legends that suggested he could transform into a wolf, larger than horses, his fur black as a storm. There were whispers of warriors who had witnessed him fight, accounts of superhuman strength, of a warrior who seemed to exist partially outside normal physical laws. But those weren't the things that mattered as he crossed the hall toward her. What mattered was the way he moved, with absolute certainty, as though the space between them was already his, already theirs. What mattered was the way his eyes never left hers, the way the amber in them deepened as he approached, seen as if the bond itself was pulling them together like gravity, inexorable and powerful. She could feel the pull in her chest, in her belly, in the core of her being. Every cell in her body turned toward him like flowers toward the sun. Aldric stepped forward, his hand moving to his sword with the speed of a trained warrior. "This hall is under the sovereign rule of the Eastern Territories, Thornvane. Your presence is not welcome. The betrothal is legal, witnessed, and binding." Kael stopped before the obsidian table. He looked at the scroll for a long moment, really looked at it, studying the words with the intensity of a man reading scripture, his eyes moving across each line, his jaw tightening as he read the terms of Aldric's claim upon her body and future. She could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, and the cold assessment of a warrior calculating strategy and weakness. His hands, those large, calloused hands marked by sword work and battle, clenched at his sides as he read. She could feel his fury through the mate bond, a cold, focused rage that was somehow more terrifying than any explosion of anger could be. Then he turned to face Aldric directly, and something in the air turned cold, deadly, like the moment before a storm breaks. "A contract," Kael said, his voice low and measured, each word carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "is only binding when it serves the interests of both parties, and more importantly, when neither party is bound by something older than law, something written not in ink but in the very soul by the hand of the goddess herself." He turned back to Seraphina, and his expression softened, just slightly, known just enough that she could see something deeper beneath the ice, beneath the warrior. In that gaze, she saw safety. She saw genuine protection. She saw choice, the possibility of becoming something other than property, something other than a purchased commodity. "She is mine, by the ancient laws of our people, by the bond that burns between us both, by the will of the goddess who has declared us match and mirror for each other. The bond is sealed. The goddess has spoken." He reached out and took the betrothal scroll in both hands. The parchment crackled as he lifted it, the sound dry and brittle, centuries of tradition held in his palms. The entire court watched, frozen, as he turned and walked toward the great hearth at the far end of the hall. The fire within burned red and gold, and flames reaching up into a chimney that stretched toward the roof, licking higher and higher. The heat radiating from it was intense, making the air shimmer and dance, distorting the world beyond it. His boots made no sound on the stone as he walked. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the whisper of the scroll in his hands. Every eye in the hall followed him. No one breathed. This was an act of defiance that would echo across territories, that would declare war as surely as any sword drawn. He reached the fire and paused for just a moment, holding the scroll before the flames. The parchment was old, fragile, marked with seals and signatures, and her name written in blood-red ink. For just an instant, she saw him hesitate, not in fear but in acknowledgement of what he was about to destroy, the legal framework that governed their world. And then he opened his hands, and the scroll fell into the fire. The parchment caught immediately, the edges curling and darkening as the flames embraced it. The ancient ink began to run, the carefully written words dissolving into meaningless lines as fire consumed them. She watched as her name burned, watched as Aldric's signature withered into ash, watched as every word that had defined her future transformed into smoke that rose toward the ceiling. The sound it made was like a sigh, the sound of something impossibly heavy being set down, a burden released. The flames leaped higher, reaching upward with renewed vigor, consuming the words that had defined her future, burning away the chains that had bound her since childhood, chains forged in contracts and duty and fear. Within seconds, there was nothing left, only ash and smoke and the smell of burned parchment, centuries of legal tradition reduced to nothing but embers. The fire seemed to sing as it consumed the last vestige of her old life. "She is mine," Kael repeated, his voice carrying through the shocked silence of the hall with the weight of prophecy. "By bond, by right, by the ancient laws that supersede every human contract ever written, the betrothal is dissolved." For a moment, the entire hall seemed suspended between one breath and the next. Then Aldric's voice exploded through the silence, raw with rage. "You have declared war on the Eastern Territories, Thornvein. Every border will bleed. Every treaty is void. The houses will rise against you." Kael turned from the hearth. And there was something in his expression that transcended human anger, something ancient and lupine and utterly remorseless. "Then bring your armies, bring your houses, bring every warrior you can command. I will meet them at the border, and I will make you understand what it means to stand against an alpha who has claimed his mate." He crossed the hall in a few long strides and took Seraphina's hand. His touch was warm, solid, real in a way that made the entire previous 9 years feel like a fever dream. His palm was calloused, marked by sword work and labor, and something about that ordinary truth steadied her racing heart. The mate bond hummed between them, a living thing now, connecting them at levels she was only beginning to comprehend. "Come," he said simply, his eyes never leaving hers. "Oh, your real life begins now." Seraphina had no choice and every choice, both at once. The mate bond was a current in her blood, pulling her toward him with a force she couldn't name. She had spent 9 years preparing for a life of cold duty and quiet despair. In a single moment, all of that had been burned away. As she let him lead her from the great claiming hall, past the shocked nobility and the whispers that followed, she realized she was trembling, not with fear, but with something that felt dangerously like hope. Behind her, she heard gasps of shock, heard Aldric's voice shouting orders that would be ignored. None of it mattered anymore. The journey to his castle took 3 days of hard travel, moving through the night under a moon that seemed to follow them across the landscape. Kael had brought a guard of perhaps 20 warriors, all of them mounted on war horses that looked as though they'd been bred for battle. The northern territories were wild, forests that stretched in every direction, mountains that cut the sky like teeth, rivers that ran silver and cold. The temperature dropped as they traveled north, the air becoming crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. It was nothing like the gentle eastern lands she'd known her entire life. Everything about it felt dangerous and alive and utterly transformative. Her old life seemed to belong to someone else entirely, a ghost of a woman who had almost been trapped forever. They rode in companionable silence for long stretches. The mate bond created a strange intimacy. She could feel his emotions bleeding into her own, a constant connection that was both comforting and overwhelming. His primary feeling was protective possession, layered beneath it something that felt like fascination. She sensed he was surprised to feel genuine emotion for her, that his previous experience with bonds had been different, complicated by politics. But there was something deeper, a kind of homecoming, as though he'd been searching for her in the darkness of his life, without knowing he was searching. When they stopped to make camp on the second night, Kael arranged for Elena to care for her needs and ensured she had blankets, warm food, water for washing. When evening fell and the warriors sat around the bonfire, he drew her away to a clearing overlooking a vast valley where the stars seemed close enough to touch. "I haven't taken a mate before," he said without preamble. His voice was rough. "The advisors in my court have pressured me for years, bringing forward candidates from the great houses, but none of them." He paused, eyes fixed on the distant valley. "When I walked into that hall and saw you, it was like lightning. Like every cell in my body suddenly recognized something fundamental, like my entire life finally made sense." Serafina considered her response carefully. 9 years of training had taught her to be cautious, to guard her true feelings, to give people what they expected rather than what was true. But the mate bond didn't allow for that kind of pretense. He could feel it if she lied, not with certainty, but as a wrongness in their connection, a discord that would reverberate through the bond and cause him pain. So she spoke the truth instead, words tumbling out that she had never dared voice to anyone. "I was ready to spend my life being property," she said. "To be inspected and controlled and diminished, to bear his children and manage his estates and smile pleasantly while dying slowly inside, and then you burn the contract." Something that might have been a smile touched her lips, trembling and uncertain. "It's difficult to adjust to freedom. I'm not sure I understand what it means yet. All my life, I was told I belonged to someone else. The idea of belonging to myself is terrifying." "It means," Kael said, turning to face her fully, his expression serious and intent, "that you are not mine to control. The bond doesn't work that way, despite what the old stories say. The mate bond makes you mine in the sense that I am bound to protect you, to put your well-being above my own, to give my life if necessary to ensure yours. But you remain entirely yourself. Your choices are yours. Your freedom is sacred, more important to me than the bond itself." His eyes were serious, intent, burning with sincerity. "I won't make the mistakes that Aldric would have made. I won't diminish you. I won't use you. If anything, I will spend the rest of my life discovering every reason why the goddess chose you as my match. I want to know you. I want to understand you. I want to be worthy of the gift the goddess has given me." The castle revealed itself at dawn on the third day, emerging from the mist like a dream made of stone. It was massive and ancient, built into the slope of a mountain, with towers that seemed to touch the clouds and battlements that spoke of centuries of defense. The walls were dark gray stone, weathered by centuries of northern storms, and the surface pocked and scarred from ancient battles. Serafina had expected something brutal and cold, a fortress designed purely for war, to match the fearsome reputation of its master. Instead, as they approached the gates, she found gardens, hidden in every courtyard, integrated into the very structure of the fortress itself, were carefully tended plants, Flowers bloomed in defiance of the harsh northern climate, their petals bright against the stone walls. Herbs released their scents into the cold air. Lavender and rosemary, healing plants and those used in magic, fragrant with life and care. Fruit trees, heavy with apples and pears, grew in protected alcoves, their branches trained across the fortress walls. Someone with extraordinary patience had built these gardens, maintained them through harsh winters, nor coaxed beauty from stone and soil. "It was my mother's work," Kael explained, as they rode through the first gate. His voice softened in a way she'd never heard before, loss mingling with love, creating a texture of emotion she could feel bleeding into her through the mate bond. Before she died, she came from a southern territory, you see, and she always felt the northern cold too deeply. So she built these gardens, I think partly to remember her home, partly to create beauty in a place that could feel harsh and unforgiving. He paused, his eyes distant, remembering. The gardeners have been tending her vision for 30 years now. She's been gone a long time, but no one has ever had the heart to let them fall into decay. They maintain them as she would have wanted. And I think that's its own form of love. He glanced at Seraphina, his expression vulnerable in a way that made her heart constrict. "I thought you should know that about me, that despite the war and the reputation, there is beauty here, there is cultivation, there is peace, when the circumstances allow it. There is a place in me that isn't all warrior and hardness. There is a place that understands the value of beautiful things." The people of the castle had been informed of their Alpha King's mate claim. Word traveled faster than horses in a kingdom bound by blood and magic, carried by the telepathic networks that connected packs. The courtyard was lined with warriors and servants and curious onlookers, all of them bowing as Kael led her through, their movements synchronized and respectful. But beyond the ceremony, beyond the formal gestures, Seraphina noticed something that surprised her deeply. The people looked happy, not the false happiness of those bound to duty and compulsion, but genuine contentment that radiated from their faces. They smiled at each other as they passed. Children played freely in the courtyards, laughing and running without fear, their voices ringing through the stone spaces with pure joy. The warriors had an ease about them, a camaraderie that spoke of trust and respect rather than fear and hierarchy. They greeted Kael with genuine affection when he passed, calling out greetings that were informal and warm, not the stiff obsequiousness of fearful subordinates. Some of the older warriors even reached out briefly to touch his shoulder in a gesture of connection, a gesture he returned. This was a different kind of kingdom than she had imagined. The halls of the castle were lined with books. This was the revelation that most fundamentally changed Seraphina's understanding of Kael Thornvane, the Alpha King. The castle library occupied an entire wing, with shelves that stretched from floor to vaulted ceiling, thousands of volumes bound in leather and cloth, their spines marked with gold lettering. The scent of aged paper and leather bindings filled the air, intoxicating in its richness. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margot, greeted them with open pleasure, and Seraphina watched as Kael's expression transformed completely in her presence. He became almost tender, asking about her health, inquiring what new acquisitions had arrived, listening to her recommendations with genuine interest. And the two clearly had a deep history, a relationship built on mutual respect. "The Alpha King's favorite," Elena whispered to Seraphina, "is poetry. War poetry, philosophy, even the soft words that lovers write for their beloveds. He sits in the library at night when he can't sleep, reading for hours. Margot says he knows entire verses by heart. Warriors have been known to find him there at dawn, lost in a book, having never made it to bed." They gave Seraphina chambers of her own, a suite of rooms that connected to Kael's through a passageway but maintained absolute privacy. The bedroom was larger than her entire previous home, with a 4-poster bed draped in fabrics that felt like water against her skin when she tested them with trembling fingers. The windows overlooked the gardens, and she spent her first afternoon simply looking out at the flowers and pathways, her mind struggling to comprehend the change in her circumstances, the radical transformation from betrothed chattel to honored mate. The wardrobe they had prepared for her was unlike anything she had ever owned. Gowns in deep jewel tones that made her green eyes shine like emeralds, simple everyday dresses in soft fabrics that moved like whispers against her skin, undergarments that actually fit her properly, designed with her comfort in mind rather than structure and control. There was a writing desk positioned near the window, stocked with parchment and ink and quills, far superior to anything she'd used before. When she discovered the small library attached to her chambers, shelves lined with books on history and philosophy and poetry, and clearly curated by Margot, with Seraphina's tastes in mind. She actually wept. Someone had thought about her comfort. Someone had anticipated her needs and desires. After a lifetime of being treated as a burden to be managed, the experience was profoundly disorienting. That evening, as the sun turned golden and began to sink toward the western mountains, Elena helped her prepare for the formal banquet, welcoming Seraphina as Luna, a title that still felt foreign on her tongue, a role she was still learning. As they walked toward the great dining hall, Seraphina felt a moment of paralyzing panic. She had no idea where to sit, what the expectations were, how to navigate this new social hierarchy. The customs of the northern court were undoubtedly different from what she had been trained for. But Kael simply took her hand as they entered the vast space, placed it gently on his arm, and led her to a seat beside his at the head of the long table. He kept his hand on the small of her back throughout the entire meal, a constant gesture of reassurance and inclusion that felt like an anchor keeping her grounded. When she hesitated over which utensil to use, he simply smiled with understanding and followed her lead, demonstrating by his own choices that there was no expectation of perfection, no test she might fail. The evening unfolded with genuine warmth. The warriors celebrated their Alpha King's happiness. The court members welcomed her with authentic interest rather than court politeness. Musicians played soft songs in the background that drifted through the hall like smoke. And through it all, Kael's presence was steady and supportive, his attention never wavering from her well-being, his eyes finding hers across the table whenever she felt uncertain. That night, after the formal banquet welcoming Seraphina as Luna, Kael invited her to his personal chambers. She expected formality, the consummation of the bond, the beginning of her duties as his wife. Instead, she found him standing at the tall windows overlooking the northern mountains, starlit and vast and beautiful. The room was warm, lit by firelight. On the low table beside his reading chair lay an open book, and she recognized the hand-stitched binding, the careful preservation of ancient pages. "I thought you might like to hear something," he said, gesturing for her to sit beside him. His voice was gentle, almost vulnerable. When he lifted the book, its leather cover worn from handling, and read aloud. The verses were from an ancient poet, words about longing and discovery, about the strange alchemy of meeting someone and recognizing them as home. His voice transformed as he read. The hard warrior became something softer, something that understood the world beyond tactics and battle, beyond violence and power. She heard him, really heard him, for the first time. When he finished, he set the book down and looked at her with an expression that made her heart constrict. "I want to know everything about you," he said. "Your favorite color, the first memory that made you happy, whether you prefer tea or coffee, the dream you had when you were 7 years old, the secrets you've kept from everyone because they wouldn't understand. So I want to know the Seraphina that you are when no one is watching. I want to know the dreams you had before the contract, before duty, before you learned to diminish yourself." He reached out and took her hand gently, his fingers warm and strong. "The bond connects us physically, but I want to build something more. I want to know your mind, your heart, your soul. That's what it means to be mates in the truest sense. That's what I'm asking of you." The intimacy of it overwhelmed her. She had expected to be taken, used, her agency surrendered to his position. Instead, he was asking for her presence, her truth, her willing participation in something they would build together. The tears came unexpectedly, 9 years of tension releasing all at once, the accumulated weight of fear and resignation draining away. She found herself weeping, and he simply held her, his arms around her steady and warm, asking nothing, offering everything. He didn't offer comfort with empty words. He simply held her hand and waited, giving her space to process her own emotions. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, shaky with tears. "My favorite color is green like the forest after rain. When I was 7, my father took me riding for the first time, and I felt like I could fly. That moment of freedom when the horse was galloping and the world was just wind and speed and possibility. I prefer tea with honey. The secret I've kept is that I always believed there might be someone who would choose me freely, who would see me and want me not for alliance but for myself. I thought it was a foolish dream, so the kind of fantasy that girls were taught to abandon when they became women." She looked up at him, and the amber in his eyes reflected the firelight, warm and real. "But here you are." The weeks that followed were a slow transformation. Seraphina emerged from her chambers each day with the sense that she was learning a new language, the language of true choice, of a partnership built on mutual respect rather than obligation. Kael showed her the castle, introduced her to the people who served and protected the kingdom, included her in councils where war strategy was discussed. He didn't diminish her voice or dismiss her thoughts. When she offered suggestions for how certain supply issues might be resolved, he listened and implemented her ideas. When she expressed interest in understanding the history of their territories, he arranged for the court's historians to give her private lessons. She was not a decoration or a broodmare. She was a presence, a mind, a valuable participant in the running of the kingdom. If you're enjoying this story of a woman transformed from property to partner through the power of a true mate, bond, consider subscribing. We share stories like this every week, tales of wolves and fated mates, of alpha kings, and the women who claim equal power beside them. One morning, Kael invited her to the training grounds. She had been hesitant. She had never trained in weapons, had been raised to be refined and ornamental. But he was patient, and he taught her, not with the intention of making her a warrior, but of helping her understand the strengths within herself. He showed her how to assess an opponent, now how to use speed and leverage rather than pure strength, how to move through combat with intention and presence. His hands were gentle as he corrected her stance, but his instruction was serious. She watched him train with his warriors, the economy of movement, the total control, the way his mind seemed to work 3 steps ahead of his body. She saw him disarm opponent after opponent, each move deliberate and precise, and she saw how his warriors responded, with respect bordering on awe, with complete trust in his leadership. When their eyes met across the training grounds, the mate bond hummed between them, visible to anyone paying attention. His expression softened immediately, a complete transformation from the warrior to the mate. She spent hours in the library discovering poetry and philosophy, learning that reading had been her secret joy all along, a joy she'd been forced to suppress in her previous life. Margot, the librarian, became a confidant, an older woman who recognized in Seraphina a hunger for knowledge and understanding. Through Margot, Seraphina learned that Kael came to the library most nights, that he had particular favorites he returned to again and again, that his mind was far deeper and more complex than any warrior's reputation could convey. She found him one night, reading by candlelight near the tall windows, and she sat across from him in silence, and they read together, existing in companionable peace. Hours would pass without a word spoken, yet the communication between them was constant and profound through the mate bond. She could feel his mind engaging with the text, his emotional responses to the verses, his pleasure at her discovery of new favorite passages. The formal meals in the great hall became a study in the court's gradually shifting understanding of their Luna. In the first days, Seraphina had been nervous, the center of attention, being assessed by every noble and warrior in the kingdom. But Kael had simply taken her hand, squeezed gently to offer reassurance, and the anxiety had melted away. He introduced her to the various territories' representatives, ensured she understood the complex politics, deferred to her opinion on matters. At one dinner, when a visiting lord made an offhand comment about alpha predilections for subservient mates, Kael had responded with such cold steel in his voice that the entire table had gone silent. "My mate speaks with equal authority in matters of state," he had said, his eyes never leaving Seraphina's, his hand possessive and warm on her back. "Her counsel is law." The message had been unmistakable. She was not a possession. She was a partner, and to diminish her was to diminish the Alpha King himself. And there were the werewolves. This was perhaps the most startling revelation. Kael kept 6 of them in a protected enclosure within the castle, massive creatures, black-furred and intelligent, with eyes that held awareness and emotion. They were magnificent and terrifying, each one bearing scars from battle. Their names were Storm, Obsidian, Rend, Ash, Void, and Midnight. He spent time with them daily, and Seraphina discovered that they had names, personalities, preferences. Storm preferred the mornings, humoring her massive head resting contentedly against Kael's leg while he read. Ren was aggressive, protective, only truly calm when Kael was present. Obsidian seemed sad, as though carrying some ancient grief. He would read to them as well, she learned, sitting with them in the evening and reciting poetry while they listened with something that resembled contentment. When she asked him why, he explained that the transformation into wolf form was often disorienting, the human mind struggling to maintain itself within the lupine body. Poetry helped bridge that gap, kept them connected to their humanity even when their wolf nature dominated. The verses seemed to settle something in them, a reminder of what they were beyond the savagery of battle. She joined him one evening in the enclosure. You and the wolves, who had been wary of her initially, gradually relaxed. Kael introduced each one, explaining their temperaments, their histories. Storm had been with him longest, since he was barely more than a pup. Midnight had been saved from a poacher's trap, her legs scarred but whole. He spoke to them with genuine affection, and Seraphina understood that these were not merely weapons to him. They were companions, brothers and sisters, bound by transformation and war. She sat on the ground, and one of the wolves, Storm, placed her massive head in Seraphina's lap. The creature's fur was thick and warm, and Seraphina felt tears prick her eyes at the trust being offered. She ran her hands over Storm's head, and the wolf made a low, rumbling sound that Kael said was contentment. Together, one of the three of them existed in companionable peace while Kael read aloud from a volume of ancient verses. The words washed over them, verses about loyalty, about the bonds between souls that transcended form or flesh. Storm's eyes closed, and Seraphina felt the mate bond hum with Kael's quiet joy at seeing the two beings he cared for most finding peace in each other's presence. The mate bond deepened through all of this. Not through physical intimacy alone, though there was that too, tender and passionate and utterly transformative, but through genuine companionship. The constant hum of connection between them became richer, more textured. She could feel his moods fluctuating with the news from the borders, sense his frustration during council meetings, understand the weight he carried as alpha. In return, he seemed to sense when she was overwhelmed or homesick, and he would find her in the library or the gardens and draw her back toward peace. They developed their own language, a shorthand of glances and touches, understanding that went deeper than words. It was during a spring festival, 2 months after they'd claimed each other, that Aldric made his move. The castle hosted celebrations throughout the season. Feasts and music, dancing in the courtyards, games and tournaments. Seraphina had been given complete freedom to design much of the festival. The gardens had been decorated with lights that hung from trees like captured stars. Long tables were laden with food that had been prepared for weeks. Roasted game, fresh bread, honey cakes, and wine from the south. Musicians had been brought in from the surrounding villages. It was for the first time in her life, Seraphina felt like she belonged somewhere, like her ideas and choices genuinely mattered. She had designed the layout, selected the music, and created themes for the various days. A night of masks, a tournament of games, a feasting night. Kael had implemented every suggestion without caveat. She felt genuinely seen, valued, treated as a partner in the running of the kingdom. The first night of the festival had been joyous, the entire castle alive with celebration. Seraphina had danced with warriors who treated her with affection and respect, and when the music slowed and Kael claimed her for a dance, the entire court fell quiet to witness it. The Alpha King and his Luna, moving together beneath a canopy of lights. It felt sacred, like the goddess herself was watching and approving. He held her gently, moved carefully, as though she were precious beyond measure. That night, as they returned to their chambers, they made love with tenderness that transcended the physical, a melding of souls through the mate bond that left her transformed and truly safe. On the second night of the festival, the moon rose full and silver above the castle. Seraphina ventured into the moonlit garden alone. Elena had retired early, exhausted from preparations. Kael was in the great hall, attending to diplomatic matters with border representatives. She simply wanted a moment of quiet, a chance to breathe the night air and appreciate her new life. The garden was breathtakingly beautiful in moonlight. The flowers had closed for the night, but their scent lingered. Lavender, wild roses, growing things. The stone paths seemed to glow with their own luminescence. She followed a path toward a small pool that reflected the moon perfectly. She sat on the stone edge, looking at her reflection, and saw a woman transformed. Eyes bright with happiness, face peaceful and glowing. And there, in that moment of peace, everything changed. Hands grabbed her from behind, unknown hands, hard male hands, and in that instant, her blood turned to ice. She tried to scream, but a leather-gloved hand clamped over her mouth. She was lifted, carried towards shadow. Her mind raced, survival instinct screaming. The hands holding her were expert, practiced. She realized immediately this was Aldric's work. When an alpha lost his prize, he took it back. The figures that held her wore dark clothes, unmarked by any sigil or insignia. Assassins or mercenaries, trained men clearly, it didn't matter which. What mattered was the moment when she felt the mate bond suddenly scream with alarm, felt Kael's awareness of her danger slam into her like a physical blow, like lightning striking through her entire body. The connection between them, which had been a gentle hum of contentment just moments before, suddenly became a roaring inferno of fury and protective rage so consuming it nearly knocked the breath from her. She could feel his emotions cascading through her in waves, terror that overwhelmed even his warrior training, a fear that transcended logic, rage so pure it was almost holy, a need to protect her that transcended everything else, every consideration, every strategic thought. The bond was screaming, vibrating with his fury. She felt the transformation begin in him before she actually saw it. The castle seemed to shake, literally shake, the ground trembling as though the earth itself was responding to his fury. Somewhere far above, a window shattered, the sound of breaking glass ringing through the night air. The very night air itself seemed to distort, to ripple. And then, emerging from the castle, shadows like a storm made flesh, like fury given form, came the wolf. He was massive beyond any imagination she could have conjured. Not a normal wolf, not even a dire wolf, but a creature of legend made manifest, black-furred with fur that seemed to absorb light itself, becoming darker than the night around him. His eyes glowed silver in the darkness, not reflecting light but emanating it, burning with primal intelligence and rage. His muscles rippled beneath his coat like moonlight on water, its shifting and flowing with supernatural strength. He was the size of a war horse, larger, his shoulders rising as high as a mounted man's head, his body stretching the length of multiple men. His teeth were like ivory daggers, glowing white in the darkness of his fur, visible when he snarled. His paws were enormous, each one the size of a man's head, and when he took a step, the ground seemed to shudder beneath the weight of him. The sound he made wasn't a howl exactly. It was something beyond that, something primal and ancient, something that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the bones of the mountain on which the castle stood. A rumbling that shook bones and made the very air vibrate with power, a sound that contained all the rage and protective fury of an alpha watching his mate being stolen. When the mercenaries released her immediately, dropping their hands as though she had burned them, running in blind panic toward the wall, their training shattered by the supernatural presence before them. They were fast, professional, but they were nothing against what Kael had become. He moved with a speed that defied physics, pouncing on the nearest one with lethal grace, a creature of pure instinct now, all predator and power and protective fury. There was a brief, terrible moment of violence, sounds that Seraphina couldn't quite process over the roaring in her ears, a primal rage unleashed upon those who dared touch his mate. But his focus was on her. She could feel it through the bond. Even in wolf form, even consumed with fury, every cell of his being was oriented toward her safety. He was aware of every fiber of her being, every detail of her condition and emotion. His killing was efficient, absolute, and then he was gone from that spot, his massive form covering the distance to her in seconds. He transformed back to human form as he reached her, the shift taking only seconds, a process that defied nature itself. Bones cracked and reformed with the sound of breaking wood, fur receding into skin, the beast becoming man in a moment of terrible beauty. The scent of transformation filled the air, something like ozone and magic and raw power. He caught her as she stumbled forward, his arms wrapping around her so tightly she could barely breathe, pulling her against his chest with enough force that she feared her ribs might crack. But she didn't care. He was there. He was real. She was safe. He was warm, still partially transformed. His skin heated from the rapid shift, burning against her cold skin, his body trembling with the violent after effects of the transformation, muscles still twitching as they resettled into human form. "You're safe," he repeated over and over, his voice rough and raw with something that transcended language, his breath ragged. "You're safe. I have you. I have you. No one will take you. No one will ever touch you again. I swear it on my blood, on my bond, on everything I am." His hands moved over her, checking for injuries, his touch frantic even as his voice tried to project calm. "Seraphina? My Seraphina, look at me. Are you hurt? Where did they touch you? Tell me where they touched you so I can—" He stopped himself, drawing a shuddering breath, forcing himself to focus on her safety rather than revenge. "I'm here. The danger is past. When I will never let anything harm you again." His skin was still heated from the transformation, glowing with residual power, his whole body trembling with barely controlled rage and the violent expenditure of energy. But beneath that fury was something deeper, raw terror. He had been afraid of losing her in a way that transcended rational thought. The bond had made her precious to him in a way that went far beyond politics or honor or alliance or strategy. She was his mate, his partner, the other half of his soul, and the thought of her being taken, claimed by another, had literally torn his human form away from him. The transformation had been involuntary, born of pure instinct so strong it had overridden his control. His hands continued to shake as he held her, his breath coming in ragged gasps, slowly returning to normal. The castle erupted into chaos after that, a controlled but frantic response to the threat. Warriors poured from every entrance, weapons drawn, searching for additional threats to their Luna, their protective fury second only to Kael's own. The captured mercenaries, the ones who had survived, were questioned brutally and confessed immediately, broken both by fear and by the supernatural presence of an enraged alpha. Aldric had paid them handsomely to retrieve his former bride, had offered them positions in his armies if they succeeded, had filled their heads with promises of power and wealth. He had believed that by taking her back, he could force Kael into a position of negotiation, that he could perhaps force her to sign new contracts, perhaps even win her in a formal challenge. The arrogance of the miscalculation was staggering. It is the stupidity of underestimating the depth of a true mate, bond almost incomprehensible. What Aldric had catastrophically miscalculated was the depth of the mate bond, the way it had transformed Kael from a powerful alpha into something even more dangerous, a male with something genuinely precious to protect, something more valuable than his own life, more important than territory or power. The threat at the border became less theoretical after that night. Kael's armies began to mobilize in earnest, a response that was swift and absolute and terrifying in its efficiency. Every fortress was strengthened, every warrior called to readiness, every strategic position reinforced. Patrols doubled and tripled and quadrupled, creating an impenetrable network of defense. The message was unmistakable to anyone with eyes to see. Any further aggression would be met not with negotiation or mercy, but with absolute annihilation. Aldric had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Aldric's response was to gather his own forces, a desperate show of strength designed to demonstrate that he would not be intimidated. For 2 weeks, the border became a staging ground for war, armies amassing on both sides like gathering storm clouds, like two fronts of cold moving toward collision. The northern forces were superior, more disciplined, better trained, more experienced in warfare. The eastern forces had numbers but lacked the coordination and unity of purpose that the Alpha King commanded. Seraphina watched from the castle, her heart constantly caught between terror and faith, sunned between the knowledge of Kael's power and the fear of losing him. She had come to know him not as a warrior or a legend, but as a man who read poetry to his wolves, who maintained gardens with his mother's legacy, who desired her mind as much as her body. But she also understood, watching him prepare for war, that this was the other side of what it meant to be an Alpha King. The protection he offered came with a willingness to burn the world to ashes if anyone threatened her. There was a line in him, a boundary that could not be crossed, and Aldric had not just crossed it, he had obliterated it. She could see it in his eyes in the morning, in the rigid set of his jaw, in the way his hands clenched and unclenched. The willingness to end Aldric completely, to erase him from existence. In the end, there was no battle. Aldric, no watching from his own war camp the sheer size and discipline of Kael's forces, recognizing with cold certainty that his own army was simply outmatched, that he would be annihilated in any direct confrontation, chose to withdraw. His pride, which had already been wounded by the loss of his betrothed, could not sustain another public defeat. A formal message arrived at the castle 3 days before the proposed confrontation, delivered by a rider who was terrified to deliver it, who bore the message with shaking hands. It contained a single phrase of formal surrender. Let it be known that Lord Aldric Varen formally renounces all claims to the Eastern Territories and acknowledges the supremacy of the Alpha King. The betrothal contract is null and void, has been null and void since its burning, and all debts between the houses are settled. Lord Aldric withdraws his forces and requests peaceful disengagement. It was a complete capitulation, written in the language of formal surrender and humiliation. As Seraphina read it, she felt something release in her chest, the final piece of her old life, burning away to ash just as the betrothal scroll had burned in the hearth of the great claiming hall months ago. She was no longer bound. She was no longer in debt to family or contract or circumstance. She was free. She was safe. She was home. The coronation ceremony, when it came, was unlike anything she had imagined in her wildest dreams. She had expected to stand at Kael's side, to be presented as his bride, perhaps to receive his crown passed to her as the traditional gesture acknowledging the mate's place. Instead, Now, when she arrived in the great hall, now fully restored from the chaos of the betrothal day, decorated with flowers and banners of celebration, she found that a second throne had been constructed, identical to the Alpha King's in design, but distinct, unmistakably her own. The matching pair stood side by side, equals in every way, two thrones that proclaimed the equality of their rule. They were not positioned as though one was secondary. They were perfectly matched, speaking to the world that the Luna held equal authority with the king. As she walked forward in her coronation gown, a dress of deep emerald silk that matched her eyes perfectly, fitted at the waist with silver thread that caught the light and threw it back in fractal patterns, the skirt flowing like water behind her, knee an underdress of pale gold silk visible beneath. She felt the weight of thousands of eyes upon her. The entire court had gathered in the great hall, filling every space, representatives from every territory, noble and common alike, warriors and merchants and scholars and servants. They were here to witness not a bride being claimed, not a prize being displayed, but a Luna being crowned in her own right. This was her coronation, not merely a ceremonial acknowledgement of his claim upon her. She was being elevated, recognized, honored as an equal ruler of the realm. Her feet moved across the stone floor with purpose and presence, no longer the hesitant walk of a woman walking toward her own diminishment, but the confident stride of a woman walking toward her own ascension. Kael stood at the dais, his eyes burning with emotion. Beside him stood Margot the librarian, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Margot held a crown, silver and wrought in the shape of a wolf's head, intricate and magnificent. Amber stones formed the eyes, catching the light like living fire. It had been crafted specifically for Seraphina, designed to celebrate her as a unique and sacred being. Margot raised her voice. "The Luna bears the crown not as ornament," she said, "but as symbol of her absolute authority alongside her mate. She rules not by his grace, but by her own right, bound by the choice of the goddess and by her own freely given consent. Her word carries weight equal to his. Her counsel is law. Her authority is absolute." The crown was placed upon her head with ceremony and reverence, and Seraphina felt the weight of it, real and substantial and absolutely perfect. And it settled against her hair, like it had always belonged there, like it had been waiting across time itself for her to come and claim it. The cool metal rested against her skin, and she could feel the magic woven into it, the power of generations of tradition and truth encoded in silver and stone. In that moment, she was no longer property. She was no longer a piece to be moved on a board controlled by others. She was Luna, queen, ruler, sacred. And then Kael Thornvane, the Alpha King, knelt before her. The entire court gasped in unison. An Alpha King did not kneel. And yet there he was, his magnificent frame bent before her, his eyes raised to meet hers with absolute sincerity. The gesture spoke of equality and choice rather than dominance and demand. "I swear," he said, his voice carrying through the silence with perfect clarity, "that I will spend every day of my life honoring the woman you are, protecting your dreams, amplifying the voice that should have been heard. I swear that I will be your partner, your equal, your devoted servant in all ways. I swear to love you because of your strength and independence. I swear on my blood, on my bond, on my honor as an Alpha King, that I will never diminish you, never control you. You are my Luna, my queen, my mate, and my partner. You are sacred." He took her hand carefully, reverently, and kissed it gently, his eyes never leaving hers, the connection between them burning bright through the mate bond. She could feel his emotion through that connection, raw and real and utterly genuine, a love so deep and true it transcended words. Then he rose, his movement graceful despite his massive size. You're coming up before her, like a warrior accepting a truth he had always known in his bones. When he looked at her, the amber in his eyes was bright and shining, reflecting the light of the torches and the magic of the mate bond, glowing with something that might have been tears. She could feel the depth of his emotion through their connection, a profound and absolute devotion that asked nothing but gave everything. The court erupted into cheers, not the forced enthusiasm of ceremony, not the mechanical applause of duty, but genuine roaring celebration that shook the very stone walls of the great hall, that seemed to make the ancient building itself sing with joy. Warriors pounded their fists against their chests in the ancient salute of the wolf clans, a rhythmic, thunderous sound, like storm clouds moving across the earth. Women wept openly, in tears streaming down their faces, moved to their core by the radical and beautiful act of submission the Alpha King had performed, a gesture that transcended mere politics and spoke to something sacred and true. The common folk in the gallery stood as one, and their voices rose in acclamation that seemed to come from the very depths of their souls, a sound of pure celebration and recognition. The music began, pipes and drums working together, strings joining in, creating a song of celebration and triumph that seemed to vibrate through the very air. And there, standing before them all, was Seraphina, the girl who 9 years ago had been inspected like livestock, had been promised to a man who saw her as nothing more than property to be acquired and controlled. She stood before them all now wearing a crown of her own, in standing equal beside a man who had chosen her freely and completely, who had kneeled before her and pledged himself to her. The transformation was complete. She was no longer property. She was no longer chattel. She was Luna. She was queen. She was seen, honored, and absolutely sacred. But it was what happened in that moment, when Kael rose from his kneel and took her hand, that changed everything. The mate bond between them flared, visible to every wolf in the room, a connection so bright and pure it seemed to light the entire hall from within, a golden light that emanated from their joined hands and spread throughout the space. Every creature present could see it, could feel the truth of it radiating outward in waves of pure spiritual power. This was not a political match. This was not an alliance formed for strategic purposes. This was the goddess's design, written in the ancient language of souls, a bond that transcended every human law and contract ever created. As the ceremonies concluded and the celebration continued, warriors dancing and music filling the night air, Kael drew her away for a private moment to a balcony overlooking the castle gardens. They walked through candlelit corridors, his hand warm in hers, the connection between them steady and strong. The balcony opened onto a vista of breathtaking beauty. The flowers were in full bloom, a riot of color and scent, the result of 30 years of careful cultivation and love, of a mother's legacy tended by devoted hands. Roses in deep reds and soft pinks, lavender in shades of purple and blue, other flowers whose names Seraphina had learned over her weeks here. Music drifted up from the courtyards below, pipes and drums, laughter and celebration. The sky was beginning to turn gold as sunset approached, the sun descending toward distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose and deep purple. The air was cool and carried the scent of the gardens, of growth and life and possibility. "I have something for you," he said softly, producing a small box from his pocket. His hands were slightly nervous, and she could feel his vulnerability through the bond, the way he wanted this moment to matter, the way he had clearly thought carefully about this gift. Inside the box was a pendant, silver, shaped like a wolf's head on one side and a woman's face on the other, intricately carved with extraordinary skill and perfectly matched. The two images fit together perfectly, forming a complete whole when viewed as one piece. To commemorate the day everything changed, the day the goddess brought us together, you will wear this over your heart, close to the mate bond, so that anyone who sees it will know that you are claimed by love, protected by choice, honored as sacred. Seraphina looked at the pendant, then at the man beside her, and she understood finally what it meant to have a future. Not a future mapped out by others, not a future of quiet suffering and diminishment and the slow erasure of self, but a future of her own choosing, built beside someone who saw her completely and chose her anyway, who knelt before her and pledged devotion. The girl who had walked into the great claiming hall as property had been transformed by fire and freedom into a Luna, a queen, a partner in the truest sense. She had reclaimed her life and her power. She had been seen, honored, and saved. The mate bond sang between them, not the frantic, all-consuming passion of initial connection, though that still existed and flared to life when they touched, but something deeper and more real and more lasting. The promise of a lifetime together, written not in contracts but in the beating of two hearts that had learned to synchronize perfectly, in the love that burned hotter and more enduring than any flame ever could. It was a love built on choice, on mutual respect, on the genuine desire to see each other fully and completely, to support each other's growth and honor each other's power. In the fading light of sunset, with the castle gardens spreading out below them and music drifting up on the evening breeze, they stood together, not as conqueror and conquered, not as master and servant, but as true partners, two equal souls bound by something that transcended explanation. Far to the east, in territories diminished by his own cowardice and poor judgment, Aldric watched reports of the coronation arrive by courier. The descriptions came in fragments: a woman in emerald silk and silver, crowned with a magnificent wolf head crown, magnificent and powerful and absolutely sacred, A king kneeling before her in an act of devotion so complete it shook the foundations of everything he understood about power and dominance. And the light between them, the mate bond, visible to every wolf in the room, burning so bright it could not be denied or dismissed. Aldric understood, finally, what he had lost the moment he had tried to assess Seraphina as livestock, the moment he had opened his mouth and spoken to her as though she were property rather than person. He had been looking at a woman whose worth transcended any contract, any legal arrangement, any claim of ownership. By refusing to see her as anything other than a possession to be bought and sold, he had ensured his own defeat before the battle even began, had made himself irrelevant to a woman of genuine power. Power, he realized too late, with the bitter clarity of failure, belonged to those who could recognize and honor the power in others. In trying to diminish Seraphina, he had only revealed his own profound weakness, his own bankruptcy of spirit, and he had lost everything.